It's been a little more than a year since the World Health Organization declared a state of pandemic. As countries around the world race to vaccinate as many people as possible, concerns remain about the fairness of the process. How can society ensure it protects the most vulnerable against this deadly disease, granting access to safe, effective, and affordable vaccines? And how is this dynamic complicated at the international level with the rise of vaccine nationalism and domestically with continued vaccine hesitancy? My name is Riley Griffin. I'm a healthcare reporter with Bloomberg News, and today I will be speaking with Dawn Butler, a member of parliament representing Brent Central in the United Kingdom, Keith Churchwell, president of Yale New Haven Hospital, and Denis Mizne, CEO of the Lemann Foundation in Brazil. Put another way, here we have a healthcare provider, a policymaker, and a CEO of a philanthropic organization. Dawn, Keith, and Denis, not only do you serve different communities, but you serve your respective communities differently. To kick off the panel, I'd like to know how the pandemic has impacted those you serve. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Keith Churchwell. As a physician with great expertise in cardiovascular disease and other chronic conditions, how has COVID-19 played out in New Haven, Connecticut, and what can we learn more broadly about how the pandemic has exacerbated existing health inequities?
So, Riley, thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. The pandemic over the past 12 months has had truly a profound effect upon New Haven and actually New Haven Hospital. Over the past 12 months, we've been through two very large peaks of the virus. Last spring, we actually had a peak in April of over 470 patients in our hospital, which actually, on that calculation, would have made us the third largest hospital in the state of Connecticut with just COVID patients. We are a hospital of actually over 1,500 beds, which is the second largest hospital in the country in terms of bed capacity. The second peak, which actually began in the fall of this year and is actually really is continuing, has been a population of patients which is actually larger than the population that we saw in the first peak. Well over 2,200 patients who have been COVID positive, very sick, complicated in our ICUs and actually in our step-down area that we've had to treat. With well over 10,000 patients actually discharged from our health system in that period of time. The impact from a financial standpoint, from a social standpoint, from an educational standpoint for the city of New Haven and the surrounding area has been profound and actually very consistent with what we see not only here but across the nation. Our hope is actually vaccination, that we actually can move towards in this spring and summer in terms of a new normal.
Turning to Dawn, Brent has been one of the worst affected places in England. What has the impact been on your constituents in Brent Central, and what tools have you used to alleviate the burden of disease on the community prior to getting vaccines?
So in the very beginning, what COVID did and this pandemic did was shine a spotlight on all of the inequalities that already existed in society. And health outcomes for people who are not in the high end of earners was always very low. So it meant that we were losing, on some days, 12 people a day were dying from COVID. And then on average, it was around 4 people a day. So there was a rush in regards to ensuring that we were able to safeguard people who, for instance, had to shield at home, who had comorbidities, so that we can save lives. The rush for the vaccinations in northwest London, where I'm based, has actually been quite good. We're the first part of London to have vaccinated over 500,000 people. But there is huge hesitancy, which we're going to talk about later, in regards to vaccination. And again, that is historical in regards to how some people feel. It's not anti-vaxxers in the main. It's built on historical context of how people feel about how they're treated in the health system.
Turning to you, Denis, the Lemann Foundation is focused on ensuring quality education in Brazil. Now we've heard a little bit about New Haven and Brent in the UK, but you focus on a different population, and that is school-age children in many ways. What has been the impact of the pandemic on the education system in Brazil and those children?
It has been a very, very complicated year. I mean, everybody is mentioning inequality that was brought to light by COVID. I think in Brazil, where we are one of the most unequal societies in the world before the pandemic, right? This became very clear. And in the education system, Brazil kept its schools closed for longer than any other country in the world. Schools closed in mid-March, and they didn't reopen until, in some places now. And now they are closing again because we are facing a very serious threat from the pandemic. Brazil has been going, we have more than 1,000 people dead by COVID every day on average for the past 50 days. So we never had such a difficult moment. And kids suffered a lot, especially low-income kids, because when you talk about internet connectivity, when you talk about access to devices, when you talk about access to high-quality online learning, this is simply not possible in areas where, you know, either you're very remote or you're living with a large family in a small piece of land. So Brazil has been severely affected, and we're hopeful that vaccination will change this reality.
That hope that vaccination will change the reality is consistent across all countries, and it really is seen as a way out of the pandemic. I want to turn to a chart for a moment because the US, UK, and Brazil each have aims to vaccinate broad swaths of the population with ultimate goals of achieving herd immunity. But already there are discrepancies in which countries have gotten access to shots and had resources to deploy them at speed. So take a look at this chart for a moment. In the UK, 37 doses have been administered per 100 people. In the US, that's 30 doses given per 100 people. And in Brazil, only about 6 doses have been given per 100 people. I'd like to think about those numbers for a moment. Some countries even have had little to no vaccinations at all. Dawn, you've recently written about how wealthy nations have more quickly been able to vaccinate their populations and argued that intellectual property rights for vaccines should be waived. But building on that notion for a moment, do you think that countries, including the UK, should export doses once they've vaccinated their willing population?
Oh, yes. I mean, wealthy nations have secured enough vaccinations to vaccinate their population 4 times over. And when we know that nobody's safe until everybody's safe, it means that we all have a responsibility to ensure that everybody's able to have access to the vaccination. But there is also a strong and ethical movement to ensure that countries are able to develop vaccines themselves. And the intellectual property and huge pharmaceutical companies making profit from a pandemic is actually something that we should all worry about. It's something that is not just ethically wrong, it's morally wrong too. So I think that it is vital that we ensure that people have, if countries do not have access to vaccinations, it means that this pandemic will not be over and the virus will continue to mutate. And we don't know in what direction the virus will mutate, whether it will mutate itself to a weaker strain or it mutate itself to a stronger, more lethal strain. And so it's in all of our best interest to ensure that vaccines are widely available.
Dr. Keith Churchwell, I want to take that thread and continue it for a moment. The US government is one of those that has touted that they've purchased enough shots to vaccinate the entire population and then some. But uncertainties remain around these vaccines, such as durability or how they will work against future variants. Is it logical then, given these uncertainties, to continue to stockpile them or have them on hand?
So, Riley, a couple of thoughts. Number one, I think the Biden administration and the president has already stated, as we go forward and we reach that goal of vaccinating as many as possible, if not all of the population, that if we have excess, it'll actually be available for the world community. I think that's incredibly important because we have to reach as true herd immunity across the world, or the virus will continue to mutate and actually be persistent. So it's in the United States' best interest. It's actually in the world's interest to actually vaccinate as many people as possible. So opportunities to actually coordinate strategies over the utilization of vaccine and excess vaccine, whether it be the United States or actually other countries across the globe, is actually going to be smart, not just for the countries that actually have vaccinated the greatest number, but actually in terms of the overall strategy to resolve this particular pandemic. Because if we don't, it'll actually just reoccur, and we'll be back to actually square one. So it is a smart strategy for us to actually move towards aggressive vaccination, not only in our own countries, but also coordinating strategies across the world.
You used the term herd immunity, so did I. Perhaps we could stop for a moment and explain to our readers what that actually means and what it takes to get to levels of herd immunity.
So that a bit is a moving target. We use the term herd immunity or community immunity. The goal is actually at least greater than 70% of the population vaccinated. Numbers in the past have told us that when we reach those goals, whether 70 to 75 to 80% of the population has some degree of resistance to the virus or to the infectious process, we will see a significant tamping down and resolution of the epidemic, local epidemics, and the pandemic. So that is the goal for us to actually achieve.
And how feasible is that without vaccinating school-age children or adolescents, which make up a big chunk of populations in the U.S. and abroad?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a bit of a moving target again, because the newness of the vaccines, the newness of this virus, us understanding the effect of the vaccine on school-age children is actually something we're trying to understand. There are ongoing clinical trials that we should actually have information on this spring, this summer, that should allow us to actually think about a pathway and the proper response in terms of giving the vaccination to school-age children. I think from a safety standpoint, this is incredibly important for us to actually move towards and to understand before we actually think about what's the next strategy for school-age children. It has been shown that the virus itself has some effect, but it's actually minimal for school-age children, but they could be a reservoir for the virus. So as we understand the virus's effect and its opportunity for vaccination, we will develop strategies, not only locally, but I think worldwide, about how we can move in that particular direction.
Denis, you are so focused on that same population, the youth. And to Dawn's earlier point about intellectual property, patents aren't always everything. Some countries quite literally don't have infrastructure in place to manufacture vaccines at scale. Tell us a bit about how the Lemann Foundation has helped with building a production facility for the AstraZeneca-Oxford vaccine in Brazil and why that project first launched.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. In terms what we saw in the beginning of the pandemic, not only with vaccines, was this big nationalism, right? In the access to medication, access to respirators, ventilators, access to protective equipment, right? It was always like that. So about almost a year ago, in April, May last year, we started thinking how we could help as a philanthropic organization that Brazil would have a chance at fighting the pandemic. And the best advice we got from healthcare and public health experts across the world was to invest in Brazil's capacity to have access to vaccines. Brazil is a special case, I think, because we do have capacity. We have two institutions, public institutions, over 100-year-olds, Butantan and Fiocruz, who are able to produce vaccines in Brazil. So the big question was to be able to have technology transfer contracts and to be able to attract the eyes of the world for Brazil in terms of vaccinations. And so we supported the clinical trials of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in Brazil, the first trials outside the UK. These were the trials that helped prove the efficacy of the vaccine. We are now testing with children, as it was mentioned before. So we're hopeful that this will help also the school population in the future. And because of the trials, this opened the conversation around transferring the technology to Brazil. And we built this coalition of philanthropic funders to allow Fiocruz to increase their capacity to be able to fully produce vaccines in Brazil. Brazil had the capacity to dilute and distribute vaccines, but we didn't have the capacity to produce it from scratch. And this is what we're starting to see. When you show the graph, Brazil got access to 6 doses about for the population. But starting next month, when both Fiocruz and Butantan are producing, we are going to have 40 million vaccines produced in Brazil. right? And this it's going to repeat every month. And this is extremely important. And the big question here is how we're going to be able to do this at scale, how we look at developing countries as a source of distributed access to vaccines and a more equitable access to vaccines. Instead, because it's as it was mentioned before, it's a global problem. We're not going to leave this problem by only focusing on our own societies. It means for your family, it means for your community, and it means for the world. So I hope this example from here will be decisive for Brazil. Brazil is one of the focus of the epidemic right now, of the pandemic right now. Hopefully, we can be an example in how to locally fight it. And I hope this will be the case over the next few months.
Something my colleagues and I on the healthcare team often talk about is speed and efficiency versus equity. And even as we have supply and are rolling it out, the shots that are going into arms are often in the US, predominantly going to white communities. And this is when we're talking about access to vaccines, but we also want to talk about willingness to get vaccines here. And so-called vaccine hesitancy has historical roots here in the US as distrust in the medical establishment prevails, particularly among communities of color which have been exploited by the government and drug companies in the name of research in the past. Keith, I want to ask you about this because we had spoken a little bit about it before, but what have the challenges been in messaging the benefits of the vaccine? And how and where have you sought to build trust in your community? And is that working?
So, Riley, we've thought about our building of trust really almost hand-to-hand combat, right? We have a significant part of the population that actually has come forward very aggressively to be vaccinated, but we have a large part of the population that actually is at the highest risk that has not. And how to work towards actually building the right pathways for not only understanding, but also acceptance and moving forward to our aggressive strategies for vaccination. A couple of thoughts that we've actually tried to work towards and actually think about from a strategic standpoint. Number one, are we in the right parts and the right pathways in terms of our communities to allow vaccination to actually move forward more easily? We have traditional places and paths that we actually have done these particular opportunities previously. We have to actually think more out of the box and going into the communities. You know, it's the Willie Sutton law. You know, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. We need to go where the patients are. And I think we've started to understand that and think about those opportunities on a daily basis and also on a weekly basis to bring the vaccine forward to those that actually have easier access and easier capability in their familiar or surroundings to go forward. Number two is actually the issues around the acceptance of the vaccine and the issues of side effects, but also the historical narrative about medicines actually in the Black and brown communities. And the way we've approached that is actually to be very transparent, to be very truthful, to actually work towards answering every question that actually comes up, understanding that no question is a dumb question in regards to this, and that this is actually this is the long path for us. It's not there are no short answers here. I'm reminded that there was a very young, intelligent African-American woman who works for us. I've been in conversation with her for the last month and a half in regards to the issues around the vaccine, its side effects, her previous issues and issues with flu vaccine, what that means for her, what it means for her community. She sent me a note yesterday. She's signed up. She's going to get vaccinated on the 15th. That's success. That's one success, but actually it can be multiplied 1,000-fold if we actually continue down this path. So making sure we have as we explain it, actually can be understood by the community at large, going forward and being very aggressive of bringing the vaccine to where people are, understanding that there are issues of resistance, how to break down that resistance, ensuring that as we communicate, they are communicating with people they are familiar with, that they can understand, and actually bring examples too of, like myself, who's been vaccinated, and to see that actually it has not been harmful, it actually has had great salutary effects for us and for the community, and to continue to spread that message.
When you say bringing the vaccines to where people are, where are those places? Are they churches? Are they schools? Yeah. What places in the community are you talking about?
The answers to that are yes, yes, and yes. Bringing it to the churches, which actually they congregate on that's where people go. That's where our Black and brown communities go on a daily basis. That's what they're familiar with. They're local schools that they have easy access to. There are local community centers, which they have easy access to. And are very familiar with. I was reading the paper for the Nashville Tennessean this morning, and they had put together a vaccination plan and profile actually in a local mosque. And they asked a question, why was that important? Well, for the Muslim community in Nashville, given the issues that have gone on over the past 10 to 15 years, their comfortability index and actually being vaccinated in a mosque is going to be much greater than that actually in downtown Nashville in a large convention center. Yeah, it's a bit about blocking and tackling and what makes common sense, what makes really sense, not only for us in terms of wanting to get and be aggressive about vaccination, but what makes sense actually for the community at large.
Dawn, I understand that you've also taken efforts to reach people in places of worship. How successful has that been?
I mean, I agree with everything that Keith has just said, and it's vital and important that people feel comfortable with getting the vaccine and the person who's administering it can answer any questions. I mean, I sit on the Science and Technology Committee, so we've had community events where we've sat and answered questions for 4 hours or 5 hours. We make sure that local doctors and pharmacies have access to vaccines where people are used to going, rather than being intimidated by going to a large vaccination centre. Especially when you've been locked in your home for so many months and going out, it is quite frightening. So you have to make the process as simple, easy and pleasant as possible. And, as Dr. Churchwell said, also being honest about, because there's lots of people now, there's lots of conspiracy theories, there's lots of things that are going around on social media groups that people are, being consumed by, and we've got to cut through all of that and say to people, get your information from reputable sources so that you can ask a question and it can be answered. And this is part of the way that we emerge from this pandemic.
And Denis, I wonder if you're concerned at all about parental vaccine hesitancy. As Keith mentioned earlier, we're currently seeing Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, AstraZeneca all launch into pediatric studies of adolescents, those 12 and up. But that data isn't coming along yet. It's very possible we have a vaccine for children by the fall. Are you concerned that parents won't be willing to give their children vaccines? And how will the education system have to boost confidence in that as well?
I think Brazil is lucky to have a large tradition in large-scale vaccination. Actually, Brazilians are very willing to be vaccinated. We just need more vaccines. And we have a great distribution system. Brazil was able to vaccinate, when we had the H1N1 epidemic, 80 million people in 3 months. So we have the capacity, we have the willingness of the population, because Brazil gives out vaccines with a very efficient way. People trust the healthcare system. So I think the big issue here is access to the vaccines. And it's great that we have capacity to produce it here, but we need more. And I think that goes through more international cooperation, more a global vision for the issue of vaccinations. Otherwise, we'll be seeing variants and variants and variants, and nobody will ever be safe. So that's our focus right now.
A great point, especially in light of emerging variants. For the sake of this panel, Bloomberg conducted a Twitter poll in which we found that 18% of respondents said they'd received a COVID-19 vaccine. Evidently, around the world and among our viewers, not everybody has gotten their first round of COVID-19 vaccines. And yet, Keith, I wonder, a note to leave us on, should governments, health systems, and community-focused programs be gearing up for another mass immunization campaign? And if we got to do it again, how can we do it better?
So Riley, the answer to that is yes. We will need to redouble our efforts. We have learned quite a bit over the last few months in regards to thinking about aggressive and expanded and expansive campaigns for vaccination. We also know that within those campaigns, we have capacity. What has limited us actually previously was the amount of vaccine available. That actually is starting to resolve itself. And with that, we need to get even more aggressive in terms of having distribution centers, within both within the local communities and a more global strategy, and also working towards even being more aggressive in terms of getting out to the public with an understanding of the why behind vaccine, its overall safety profile, and the importance of being vaccinated. So again, we're, if it was a baseball game, we've gotten through the first 2 innings, right? We're about to get into the middle part and hopefully into the home stretch, but we're not even close to the home stretch yet. And I think people should understand that and work towards winning this game.
I hope we do win this game. And I appreciate you all for joining us today. Dawn, Denis, Keith, it has been a pleasure learning from you. And we wish you all the best of luck in your fight against the pandemic moving forward.